So, my friends, there is no foreign policy issue that dominates the conversations around this town with policymakers from both sides of the aisle than China. There's lots of experts, there's lots of opinions, but there's only one person to begin this conversation with. And that is, of course, USGLC's dear friend, the U.S. Ambassador to the People's Republic of China, Ambassador Nicholas Burns. He is one of the most respected diplomats of our time, having served under 6 presidents, 9 secretaries of state during his distinguished career. There's too many positions in his post of his career for me to name, but I'll tell you this. He has 15 honorary degrees. He has so many awards, but I'll mention 2. The State Department's, the Secretaries of State Distinguished Service Award, and the Presidential Distinguished Award. Today, he leads a team of 47 government agencies at the Embassy of Beijing and 4 consulates, perhaps at the most complex mission on the globe. Now, most importantly for my sons, he happens to be a passionate Red Sox, Celtics, and Patriots fan. Please join me. He's live from Beijing, and welcome Ambassador Nick Burns. There he is. I hope. There he is. Mwah! Welcome, Ambassador. It's so lovely to see you.
It's really great to be here. 12-hour time difference. It's end of a long working day here, but I'd rather be any other place, but with all of your friends on this audience, and I'm looking forward to a good conversation, Liz. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, we have lots of questions to ask you, so let me start with this. You know, you have incredible insight into one of the most complex relationships between the U.S. and China. I know you were, I think you first visited there almost 40 years ago with the late Secretary George Shultz, and you've watched this ebb and flow relationship over those many, many decades. You were with President Biden in Bali in November when you visited, they met with Xi Jinping, and kind of hopeful at that time, but since then we've had Balloon Gate and obviously the most recent altercations. I watched as Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin was in the Shangri-La dialogue this weekend, and he expressed his disappointment that his counterpart would not meet with him. But I saw your tweet yesterday where you tweeted out Jake Sullivan, our national security advisor, who said, "We're ready to engage China without preconditions, helping to ensure that competition does not veer into conflict." Ambassador Burns, share with us your assessment right now of where we are with U.S.-China relations and where we're heading.
Liz, thank you. And again, it's good to be with you. This is, I think, in my estimation, the most important bilateral relationship, the U.S. and China, that we have now and will have for the next several decades. So for a lot of the young people in your audience today who are your fellows, you'll be dealing with China in multiple dimensions for your entire career. And Liz, I'd break it down to 3 major points. First, we have a very competitive, difficult, often very contentious relationship between the U.S. and China. We're competing on some of the most important issues in the world. We're certainly competing for military power and security in the Indo-Pacific. We have this extraordinary alliance system with Japan, the U.S. alliance system, with South Korea, with the Philippines, with Australia, a strategic military partnership with India. And it's our intention to remain the strongest military alliance structure in this part of the world. China's obviously contesting that. Secondly, we're competing on technology. And that's really, I think, in many ways, the heart of the competition between us. It's obvious that if you think about the development of artificial intelligence or quantum sciences and quantum mathematics, and also biotechnology, there'll be a commercial competition between our companies and our research universities, but all those technologies are going to be militarized. And we are determined that the United States and our allies are going to be the first movers in this market, and we're going to develop the technologies to keep us safe and to keep us strong. And we're beginning to restrict, as you know, the ability of American companies to sell items like advanced semiconductors into the Chinese market because we don't want to give the People's Liberation Army, the Chinese military here, a leg up in the competition with us. So we're competing there, certainly competing on economics and trade. We have a huge trade relationship with China. $690 billion in 2022. China's our third largest trade partner after Canada and Mexico. And yet oftentimes the competition in trade and investment is unfair because the Chinese government's use of state subsidies and of forced technology transfer, the consistent and persistent theft of intellectual property. So the playing field's not often level for American companies. And I spent a lot of time trying to help American companies have a fair chance at success here. And finally, on the competition side, obviously we've got very different values as governments and societies. We believe in human rights. We believe in freedom of speech and freedom of assembly and freedom of the press and freedom of religion. And so we have profound differences with China on Xinjiang, on the treatment of the Uyghur population there, on Tibet, and certainly on the lack of religious freedom in this country and on Hong Kong. So if you take those issues all together, and this is just a superficial description of the 1,000 different issues that we're dealing with, we're going to have to compete with China for a long time to protect American interests and American values. Now, just two more points. At the same time, President Biden has determined with President Xi Jinping that there are some places we can work together. Climate change is one of them. We're the two largest carbon emitters. China's number one, we're number two, some good distance behind. But John Kerry is working, I think, on a very practical basis with his Chinese colleague Xie Zhenhua. And obviously we have a responsibility to each other and to the world to make progress and to limit the average rise in the global temperature to 1.5 degrees centigrade in this decade. That's the goal. And we really want China to begin to arrest its carbon emissions. We think we can work with them. We hope we can in the fight against infectious diseases. If you think about the global health challenges that are ahead of us and ahead of this young generation in your audience today, certainly on the issue of food security and food security in places like the Horn of Africa. And that's been created by climate conditions, but also by Russia's vicious war and illegal war in Ukraine. And we ought to be working, obviously, on narcotics. And here I just want to pause and say to your audience, Liz, the leading cause of death among young people in the United States is fentanyl. Yep. And most of the fentanyl in the United States comes from the drug cartels in Mexico. And the precursor chemicals that make up fentanyl are sold by black market firms here in China to the drug traffickers in Mexico and Central America. So we have been pushing very hard that the government of China use its considerable power to shut down the ability of these black market Chinese firms to sell the fentanyl. And frankly, we have not seen progress on this issue. I've had discussions very recently on this. We're pushing very hard. We've taken some initiatives just in the last 2 weeks to sanction Chinese companies and Chinese individuals engaged in this really nefarious trade. And we're not going to quit in raising this issue and expecting that the government of China will do the right thing. And so there are a whole host of issues where we hope to work together. But it's complicated. We see progress on climate change, perhaps, but not progress on fentanyl. And I guess the very last thing I should say, Liz, is obviously, you know, this relationship is an important one for the future because we're the two largest economies in the world. We're the two strongest militaries. We have the two strongest science and technology foundations to our societies. And so while we compete, it's important that we manage that competition so that it has limits and barriers, and it's always a peaceful competition. And that's something that President Biden feels very strongly about. And obviously, as his representative here in China, something that I try to do every day as we deal with the government. So forgive the length of this answer, but you know, we could create an entire course at a normal university over a whole semester to look at to answer your very good question.
Well, that was an extraordinary tour de force of all of the issues. I could drill down on each one, and we only have a few minutes of your time. I have to push a little harder on your economic, starting there, but I'm going to try on those. I'm really glad you mentioned fentanyl. I did a op-ed about it a few years ago, and I'm so glad that the U.S. is continuing to push hard on that one. Economics, you just talked about the pull and tug. We've got, I hear the rumor that the Commerce Secretary might be the first cabinet secretary to go to meet you in Beijing. Two sides of that, as you said. One is they're not playing by the same set of rules of the road, but we've got almost $700 billion of trade. Nick, how do you manage to make sure and push, particularly on tech, that we are making sure America has a fair playing field? Quickly, what are you doing to help American businesses?
We're arguing with the Chinese government, the government here, to meet its commitments under the World Trade Organization, not to allow its companies to rip off the intellectual property of American companies. So trying to hold China to a standard and enlisting other countries in the world, the Japanese, the European Union, the South Koreans, to do the same thing. And I think that is beginning to have an impact on the Chinese here. That's first. Second, we're objecting to some of the practices of the government. Just in the last couple of months, we've seen 5 American companies targeted: Deloitte and Bain and Capvision and Mintz Technology and Micron Corporation. And it's not happening to companies of other countries, but it is to ours. It looks political in nature. It looks like payback from the Chinese perspective, and it's wrong. And obviously, we're going to resist this, and we're going to push back, as we've done in many of these instances. Third, your audience might not have heard of an emerging amendment to the espionage law here, which is going to go into effect on July 1st. And it broadens the definition of espionage to include activities that any business would do: due diligence, collection of data, data sets to look at a joint venture. It also could imperil not just businesses under the espionage law, but academic researchers, students, professors, scientists who use data as a normal course of what they do. And we are pushing back against the government here and advising them, and a lot of other countries are piling on with us, to change this law, because it's going to really put a chill into this economic relationship. So I must say,
Right.
I spent a lot of my time here, Liz,
I bet you do.
obviously raising very difficult issues and doing our best. And I've got a great group of people here, men and women, working with me to resist these worst aspects of the policy of the government of China.
So one question, sticking with economics for a minute, I was telling the group that I just got back from Africa. You go, frankly, anywhere in the global south, and you see the Chinese investments: a soccer field, a road, a building. I just looked at some data. Over the last 10 years, China has increased their development investments by over 430%. Their diplomatic investments, they're saying they're going to increase by $8 billion. Talk to us about what you see as how China is using, the PRC is using their development and diplomacy tools to increase their global influence, and how you see U.S. using our development and diplomacy tools to use our global influence. And I should say that the Senate Appropriations Committee just had a hearing on this very topic, and there's real bipartisan support of us upping our game. What do you see from your perspective?
Well, obviously, you've seen over the last 10 years China's Belt and Road Initiative expand everywhere in the world, not just in Central Asia and in the Southeast Asia where it started, but in Africa, in Latin America. China has become the largest trade partner of over 70 countries in the world. And China is now the biggest lender in the world, and a bigger lender than all the other countries that have normally lent: the United States, Japan, European Union, and our development banks together. So if we're looking at debt as a major problem for countries like Sri Lanka or Zambia and many other countries between, we're looking for the government here to be more responsible and to work with the rest of the world to try to alleviate the debt burden in some of these places. And I think, we're beginning to work, the United States, with the European Union, to offer an alternative where our lending would be transparent, we would be accountable, we'd have labor and environmental and human rights standards that ought to be part of any 21st century trade and investment agreement, that it concerns potential debt by a developing country. And that is obviously the way to go. So like everything else in this relationship, it really is a competition of ideas, of ideology, of one country versus another, offering a very different vision for the future. And we would hope that the vision that we are offering with a lot of other democratic countries around the world is going to be much more sustainable and more effective in the long term.
I want to go to security. You talked about one more tension, which is, of course, security, and talk about Taiwan. I visited Taiwan in November of last year. What opportunities, if any, are there to bring the tension down around Taiwan?
Well, we're trying to do that. It's very important that that the government of the People's Republic of China commit to a peaceful resolution of cross-strait differences, and they haven't done that. It's very important that when you have an event like Speaker Pelosi's trip to Taiwan last August, or Speaker McCarthy's recent meeting, Kevin McCarthy's recent meeting with Tsai Ing-wen in Los Angeles, that the Chinese understand they can't just fire rockets across the island of Taiwan. They can't cross the median line that has really kept the peace since 1954 in the Taiwan Strait, that's a critical international waterway, and that the fate of the global economy really rests on peace and the continuation of container traffic and commercial traffic through there, and that any resolution of this long festering problem has to be peaceful. That's the message that we bring to this relationship every day. And it brings up an interesting issue and an important one, Liz, and that is channels of communication between us. We've taken the position that because we have major differences between China and the United States, we've got to have more consistent conversations. And yet you saw just last weekend when Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin offered to meet with his Chinese counterpart, Li Shangfu, the new Minister of Defense, the Chinese said no to that meeting. After Speaker Pelosi's visit, the Chinese shut down our three most important military-to-military channels, and these channels are resigned to, in a crisis, to answer your question, reduce the temperature, figure out if there's been an accident, how do we resolve that without having a situation deteriorate so that you end up on the verge of conflict. There's nothing more important than that. Our militaries, our navies and our air forces, China's and America's, are operating in very close proximity to each other in the South China Sea, in the East China Sea, in the Taiwan Strait. We play by the rules. We make sure that we sail and we fly in international waters and in international airspace, and we abide by all of the necessary laws and regulations pertaining to the law of the sea. We want to see China do the same thing, and we want to see China commit to conversations between us, routine conversations, military to military. And that's also true in the diplomatic space. We hadn't had, after the balloon incident, after our public disagreement with China over Russia's war in Ukraine, we had a period of a couple of months where there wasn't much conversation. Our view is we've got to talk, and we have to talk consistently, and we'll continue to take that position with the PRC.
Can China play a constructive role in Ukraine?
We hope so. It all depends, on what decisions the government here makes. If you notice, when China published its 12-point position paper on Ukraine a month and a half ago, the very first point they made was that they said that they believe in the sovereignty and territorial integrity of any nation. That's what's at stake in Russia's illegal war in Ukraine. It's the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. So I met recently with Ambassador Li Hui, who is the Chinese ambassador who went to Moscow and Kyiv and Warsaw and Berlin and Paris on this tour to see if China could contribute to a peaceful resolution. And we hope very much that they'll make the right choice. But the right choice for China is going to push Russia to adhere to international law, withdraw its troops, and see the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine restored. That's what the world wants and expects. And so, I think the jury's out. I can't predict what the government of the People's Republic will do, but that's what we're obviously standing for, and they know our position.
Let me try to get two more questions in. You talked at your opening about it's not just competition, that's the primary mode we're in, but there is an effort to try to have cooperation. You mentioned a few. How effective have you felt you've been and the other side has been in terms of the two nations cooperating on these big global issues that we're not going to solve unless Washington and Beijing work together? Climate, you mentioned, health, food security. How are we doing on these dialogues of global challenges?
It doesn't obviously always come down to China and the United States, because you need every country in the world pulling on the same oar, as you know, Liz. But obviously, as the two big global leaders and powerful economies, we have a self-interest, obviously, to work with each other on some of these issues, but we also have an obligation to the rest of the world because climate change is not going to be addressed effectively unless 195 nation states do it together. Now, China's about 30% of global emissions. We are between 10 and 11%. We're the two largest. I actually think that the relationship that former Secretary John Kerry has built with his Chinese counterpart has been effective. And I think that's going to continue. On global health, let's hope that we can work together to reinforce the World Health Organization because we've had 4 pandemics in the last 20 years. And the law of averages we'll face another one sometime in the next several years. And we've got to be ready this time. And we hope that countries will be willing to work together in that space. So it's a really good question. And we believe that we ought to test this proposition, that China can rise to the occasion and work with us and work with other countries. But as a lot of things in diplomacy, it takes a while. It takes years to work on some of these problems. So hard to give a grade or a snapshot picture of where we are, but we're certainly pushing and hoping that the Chinese will work with us on some of the issues.
Nick, in our 30 seconds remaining, I know that one of your ambitions is to get out and try to meet with the Chinese people, not just do government to government. Give us a 30-second snapshot of how inspiring that is to do.
Well, it's important. This is a big, complicated country. It's an incredible country in many ways. The Chinese people are energetic, talented. And I've gotten out to the universities, Fudan in Shanghai, Tsinghua here in Beijing, Nanjing as well. And I must tell you, I think part of the hope of this relationship has to be people to people and students working together. Let me leave you with 2 data points. There are 295,000 Chinese students in the United States, and they enrich our country. There are only 350 American students in all of China. So we want to build that people-to-people relationship because the governments are going to compete, and that's my job. But you also want to have foundation to a relationship for the future where the peoples can understand each other, and we need the doors to be open to American students here. I hope that'll be the case. We need more American tourists here because as we compete, people need to comprise the long term of this relationship. So I think that's a big challenge for both of our countries, and I am working hard on this one.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, please thank Ambassador Nick Burns for all he does to make us safe. Mwah.
Thank you, Liz. Really good to see you. Thanks for the invitation.
Come visit.